pick things out. All right. So at random, we got an hour. And if I talk for like 45 seconds on each bullet, then we're good. And we'll get everything. Go. It's like a speed chess. You know? All right, so picking things off the list. Mandate to automate all manual regression is absolutely impossible. And as Paul mentioned this morning, you should not do this because some things really should be left to be done manually. And it comes to really the heart of what I think automation is for. So automation should be used for two purposes. It should to be able to do things that a computer's better at doing. You know, the manual, non-human necessary problems. There's a lot of these things. Testing all of the error codes that come back from a login screen. These are excellent choices to make for automation. But things that aren't good choices are things where you actually have to have humans interpret the response. Your automation, Michael Bolton did a talk years ago saying one of the problems with automation is that it doesn't have emotions. Your automation cannot get bored, frustrated, confused. It can, but it not intentionally usually. So there are places when manual testing needs to happen, and I, as an automation consultant, I'm called in to deal with these sorts of people that we're going to automate all our manual regression, and then we're going to push a button, and it's going to go. Pushing the button, having all the automation go is kind of, and then your push out into production is, well, it's Facebook and Google, but we all know how wonderful that works. And it's starting to happen more in terms of being trendy in the lean startup community. I don't know how much lean has infected Kitchener-Waterloo. It certainly has infected Boston and San Francisco, and Toronto to some degree. But in the lean startup, you have this notion of continuous deployment, where a developer or somebody checks in code, and it goes through a series of automation, pops out into production. No human intervention. As a tester, that's borderline unethical, if not completely unethical. But there is this notion of continuous delivery. And continuous delivery says, automate the things that should and could be or should be automated, and leave the stuff to the humans that really should be left to the humans. So if you see words like continuous delivery, continuous deployment, that's using automation not just in the classical regression sense, but in terms of provisioning environments, deploying software, monitoring. All these things also fall under the bucket of automation. Too often times we are at testing conferences and all you can think of is, oh, we're driving the browser. There is way more to automation than just driving the browser. In fact, driving the browser is really just the boring part of automation these days. You get more value, I found, doing all the other back-end automation stuff rather than just doing the browser automation. So use automation to do the boring manual, menial checking to be done. You can also use automation for prepping your environments. One of the first systems I worked on was Scotiabank's international banking platform, and it was a AS400 green screen application. And so in order for us to test international commercial loans, we had to create a user record, and we needed to make a loan against it, and then make some set up the situations that we could actually test at. And it was tab M space. I don't know how many people have used green screen applications, but it's all keyboard triggers, F1, F2, F5, and 4 times space tab, and then you're on the screen. We automated the stink out of that, so that we just, I want to do this, push a button, and it just went along, and then we were ready to do our manual testing. Fantastic use of automation. And one thing I did say at the beginning is I am well aligned with the Selenium project, open source. If you're a QTP vendor, I'm sorry. Or if you're a QTP shop, I'm sorry. But a tool like Selenium IDE is a fantastic tool for setting up your environment. That is about the only situation you should be using Selenium IDE in. And I can rant about Selenium IDE. I was the maintainer for 2 years of Selenium IDE, so I've got a couple rants about that, but we can worry about those later. So if people say automate all manual regression tests, just sort of smile and nod and then pretend that they never said that. Because it's impossible. Or, well, I'm sure it's possible, but it's not a good use of your time to make it possible. Let's see what's on the red. All right, so let's see, this one's covered up. So easiest scripting skill / tool for new QA analysts. So this is one of these, there is no right answer, but there are, in my opinion, righter and wronger answers. For, it's a new QA analyst. Now, does that mean, well, first the bias is we don't need to program to do automation. Automation is programming, full stop. If you are not programming to do your automation, if you're using a wonderful little record, playback, drag and drop controls into a little editor screen, you're doing something, but it's not really automation. It's like the VB6 days where you can just drag a control onto a screen and, oh, it's a button. Automation is too complicated for record and playback tools. Record and playback tools lead to what is mentioned on, I think, on every single one, maintenance problems. And I'll talk about a strategy for maintenance in a bit. But, so first you have to accept that automation is programming. Too often I've seen when somebody gets a slick presentation on how automation can reduce all their timelines. And they'll be able to ship faster and more often. Just get all their testers, their excellent manual testers, to become automation engineers. So, well, they don't know how to program. So now they're writing essentially poor code, which has maintenance problems, performance problems, design scalability problems. So if you're starting out with a new QA or a tester on the automation path, ask them if they know how to program. If they do, then that language may be the right language for them to do automation in. There are certainly efficiencies of scale if you have your entire organization automating in the same language, but there's nothing that's mandated saying the entire organization must be Java, and only code produced in Java is allowed within our walls. And I've seen this, and I pick on Java for this because it's often in large enterprises that I see this particular trait. Sometimes with .NET as well, but it's often in Java where I don't know how many of you have tried to teach programming, but there is a lot of overhead to teach somebody who has never learned to program before Java. Okay, here's the runtime, and here's object-oriented right from the get-go. Don't worry about it, just write this syntax, and it must be this way, and it may or may not compile, and it may or may not tell you an error message that helps you figure out why it's not compiling. So when I'm teaching new testers, or testers that are new to automation and programming, it is usually Python or Ruby. And if I have a choice, it's Python. It's a scripting language, so it's not compiled. Its syntax, to people that are used to curly braces, is a little frustrating, but it can be written in a functional manner or an object-oriented manner. And there's a lot less overhead to understand. I can have a person who's never programmed before writing Selenium automation in 2 days in Python, where with Java, it's, it takes longer. And a lot of you, I don't know what Waterloo's doing, but I know U of T has actually dropped Java as a year 1 programming language in their CS department. it's now year 2. You learn Python in year 1 because you get the underlying concepts of loops, variables, conditionals, and all that stuff, and then they throw in the power of a Java at you later. So in my experience, or in my opinion, I go with some sort of scripting language, Python, Ruby, and PHP. I've had a fair bit of experience writing web automation in, and it's a pretty good language for that. I'm not sure if I designed my app around it, but for automation purposes, it works fine. So for someone who's just learning scripting, those are the languages I look at. Now, from a tooling perspective, and again, I'm on the Selenium project, so that's my bias. There's people that say that they're writing Selenium scripts, which is kind of a poor name. There is no such thing really as a Selenium script. Selenium is a library that drives a browser, and you include it into your automation like you would include a crypto library or an IPv6 library or whatever. It's just a library that you make calls into. So if you are doing web automation, obviously I'm going to say that you should use Selenium, and if you get stuck, you should pay me exorbitant amounts of money to help you get unstuck. Now, but you can use, if you're doing browser automation, there's also another project called Watir, W-A-T-I-R. It's Ruby, and it's actually under the hood, it's Selenium. But it's a different API that's exposed, and some people think it's more Ruby-like. Let's see, other tools. If you're doing device work, like if you're on Android or iOS, there are a number of other tools that are available. It uses the WebDriver API, which is Selenium 2 syntactically. Android, I think Native Driver will drive Android stuff as well. I don't know about the BlackBerry platform. I think there was a project that was driving BlackBerry stuff, but I'm not sure what its state is. And as ever, feel free to interject if I'm jumping around too much, or you are an HP vendor and are challenging me on. HP and I are not friends, officially not friends. As a tester, to write scripts that are never going to hit production versus producing production code. But if you understand how to read the code that they're putting into production, you can sit there in code reviews and ask the dumb questions like, well, why are you doing this? My little knowledge of programming says that this doesn't make sense. And then somebody else looks at it like, actually, yeah, that doesn't make sense. Why did we do this? And then you have this conversation and you just go, that only works a couple times because then they realize that you actually do know what you're talking about and you can't play dumb. It's pretty fun on new teams, though, to be able to do that. To environment setup and getting 0 management support. Meanwhile, management's something. Quest, I guess that is. Kind of like a musical flat symbol. Is to automate checking, I guess. So if you're getting 0 management support, you really have 2 options. You either don't do it and say, well, I'd like to do this, but if you want to carve out time in my schedule, I can do it. Here's the benefits of it, or here's why I want to do it. And if they say no, then you've kind of done your job as a tester to say, here's the risks that you're doing, and you don't do it. And then it comes down to you can change your company or you can change your company. And which, depending on the economic realities of the situation, who knows? Or you can do it skunkworks and just do it on a weekend. So there's all sorts of, in this particular case, it was environment. The point was environmental side. So there are projects out there like Chef and Puppet, and CF Engine are the big three projects for maintaining a machine image. It's basically a monitoring process runs on the remote machine, and it phones home and says, is there anything new that I should do? And it says, yes, we've got a new user. And so it pulls down their username and password onto that server. Or, yes, we have updated the version of our mail package. And so now go get that new version. Setting up that project is that's about a weekend's worth of work. Just playing with it on your own machine, run, if you can run a Linux VM or something on your local machine using VirtualBox if you don't have VMware licenses or anything, and just get it working just locally on your one machine, and then you just sort of sneak it out. I've done all sorts of little projects like that where it would save me time, and so I just do it. Now, again, I'm fairly arrogant when I work for people, and that's part of the reasons why I work for myself, because I don't really do that well working for other people. So you just roll it out, and some organizations get really cranky if you do this. I worked at HP for, not in the automation division, because they hadn't bought Mercury at that point. And there was a big kerfuffle because there was all these, I forget what they're called, some projects, they weren't Skunk-Works, but there was some other, the IT department had sort of taken an informal survey and realized that each team or division had like a dozen of these little projects, and there was lots of redundancy between the divisions. So they basically said, you will not do a project without IT approval from henceforth. Like, we will not, we'll grandfather in all these existing ones, but you have to name them and let us report them, but there will be no more. And if you rolled out another one, they get really, really cranky. So something like, we're going to maintain all of our machines using this new tool would be one of those projects that they get cranky with. But at the same time, it may be worth, hiding it under the radar. So I don't know if that answers something like this. So any more context around this one? Red table? I think.
Well, the question was like, if we're like doing a load test, a performance test from a single source by creating multiple threads, would that simulate like a real users like approaching that kind of thing
from
various sources?
And the answer is, of course, it depends. Like, if there's any reason, if where the traffic or the load is coming from matters, then of course a single point doesn't matter. Now, like if it's a website, say, if all of the traffic comes from these two IP addresses, then it may not care. Like there may be sticky IP balancing and IP stuff at the load balancer, so maybe it counts. But if you're doing things like a user logging in and logging out and modifying their profile, then it doesn't matter where the traffic originates from. So it all, every single load testing situation is different. I work for one company, we do load testing, and it just comes from, we just kill your website from Amazon's cloud, and all the servers are in Virginia, and so that's one. It's from many different IP addresses, but it's still just the same geographic region, which may solve one of your problems, but it may introduce other ones, because maybe you have time zone stuff based upon where the IP address is coming from, or you've got IP-based geofencing around content, which is why we can't, as Canadians, we can't log into Hulu or whatever that TV site is, because they just look at the IP address and say, oh, registered to a Canadian company, they're not allowed to see the content.
Daily Show. The Daily Show.
Yeah, there's all sorts of situations like that. And it's just like, well, it's, another, I like baseball. The Blue Jays, their home territory. Anybody know what the Blue Jays' home territory is for blackout purposes? It's Canada. So if you were in Vancouver and wanted to listen to the Blue Jays game with the MLB at bat package or whatever, which you paid $150 a year to get all the baseball games, it would say, sorry, you're not allowed to because it's your local team. Just because it's your IP address looks like it's in Canada, and that's why they have the form. If you think you're not in Canada, then let us know. So it all depends upon your application. Like if single source is fine, like if all you're trying to do is max out bandwidth or max out CPU or max out memory on the web server or whatever, then single source is fine. But if suddenly where it comes from matters, and sometimes it does, just like I said at the load balancer. We were doing a load test, I guess 2 weeks ago, and the site was doing fine, but from all metrics purposes, like the CPU was fine, the memory was fine, the bandwidth between the database server and the web server was fine. We melted the load balancer. Just because it was doing sticky IP address stuff and it wasn't actually routing the way it was supposed to be doing. And it was, that's the first time I think we have knowingly done that. And that was a useful find. That wasn't the information that they were trying to get from the load test. They were trying to look for hotspots in their application. But what they realized is that they were paying this scads of money for this network pipe that their load balancer couldn't handle. And so I'm sure somebody was a little cranky that they're paying extra $1,500, $2,000 or whatever a month, that there's no possible way they could use this bandwidth. So this kind of sounds like the classical siloing problem. We've got our business folks, and our developers, and our manual testers, and our automation folks. And that's a pretty good way how not to succeed with automation. Because as mentioned here, you have your automation people that they've got their own oracles that they're using to determine what to automate. And it might be the code that's produced, and it might be just what the business analyst has written in an out-of-date Word document. And so things get out of sync. The automation really starts to succeed when you don't have the silos, or projects actually start to succeed when you don't have the silos. You have the audit, it's a perfectly fine task to have somebody who is the automation person. There is a skill set involved in that. But don't have them just working off in their own little cubby hole, or that automation person needs to be in the requirements meetings so that they understand the scope of things. Ideally, the automation person should come from a testing background. In this particular room, it's probably not hard to convince you of that. When I go out and I market myself, I point out that I'm a tester first and then a programmer. Whereas you have some organizations where the people that are writing test code are programmers first and then testers. And there's a different mental approach that you just bring to the task. It's not necessarily always how do I just solve this in very specific binary functions, but it's, well, what other things should I be considering? What about security attacks? What about localization? What about all these other things that we do and we learn as manual testers that we can apply to our automation? It's a useful exercise, if you're doing things at conferences where you have design the automation test cases for a particular thing. And if you split the room on the developers and the testers, the lists are very divergent. Except when somebody says something really loud in the other group. It's like, oh, I got this great idea, we should test Korean characters because we had this problem in production and it melted. And then somebody's like, oh, that's right. And then they trigger these other ideas. But you'll also find that on the testing side, again, wild generalizations, but it's sort of backed up by experience, the testers have way more things to automate. Programmers learning the business. If any of those groups does not really know what your organization does for a living, then how do you expect them to function during their tasks? How you prioritize bugs, how you prioritize bug testing ideas, all feeds in from understanding what your organization does. Yes, it could be a complex domain like international commercial loans, and you do not need to know the details to the minute level that the business folks do, but you need to have a mental scaffolding to be able to hang conversations about it. We'll have maintenance problems. New window. Let's find some code. Page objects. And what page objects are is it's an object-oriented representation of a page or a portion of a page in code. And that's may or may not be big enough. So what you end up doing is you have a class that represents either the full page or a section of the page, where if you have things like a header and a footer that are common across all the pages. And you start leveraging object-oriented programming principles where you get inheritance trees. And one of the benefits of this is your locators. So in Selenium, there's like 7 different ways to identify something. And for browser automation, ideally, put unique IDs on everything, on every element that you need to care about. Hopefully your framework allows you to do it. Some of your frameworks, like say Sprout Core, literally will put in a random integer or a random float as the ID. I've seen the source code. It literally is a call to the random function. And I shake my fist at them mightily. That's the easiest thing to do. And per the W3C, which controls the HTML spec, IDs must be unique on the rendered page. So you can just say, I want to access the login button by the ID. And then it doesn't matter if it's now login or sign in or check in or whatever it is displayed to the user below the scenes, it's still the same element that you're interacting with. So try not to use the visible text as your locator. And oftentimes, I think Selenium IDE is kind of getting better at this when it's recording. It's no longer using the IDs or the visible strings as much as possible, because what happens if you internationalize your application? It's no longer login, it's something in French. And this is a problem that you see more lack of awareness in the US, because everything's just English or you're screwed. Whereas in Canada, because we've got this whole bilingual nonsense, we're more cognizant of, oh, well, it could, if we want to sell to the government, it needs to be able to translate it to French. And who's the largest purchaser of software in most companies? The government. So try not to use the visible strings, because those are always subject to change. The other good thing about using IDs is it doesn't matter where that element gets moved around on the page, you can still interact with it. A common design pattern is you put the sign-in information in the top right of the page. If you are using a structural locator, such as CSS, which is a W3C standard, or XPath, which again is a W3C standard, it's structural. So it looks from the top down until it finds the thing that it's looking for. If the login section moves from the top right to the bottom left, it functions the same way, but the HTML that's being delivered to the browser is very different, and now your script breaks. And everybody's like, well, why? We didn't change the functionality, we just moved things around. Why did it break? And now you have to go update all your scripts. And it's because you're using a structural locator. XPath versus CSS, this is a big debate in the Selenium community. In general, I would say use CSS selectors as a location strategy if you need to go structural. Use it first and then fall back to XPath. There are situations, CSS for instance goes from the top of the DOM to the bottom. It cannot go back up. XPath can. So there are some situations where you need to look for an element because that's the unique thing that you can grab onto, go up 2 levels in the tree, then down 4 levels and across 5. You can't do that in CSS. Those are also great bug reports saying, I am trying to automate this and I needed to use this giant string. You know, I've had strings that I couldn't tweet. You know, Twitter is 140 characters. Here's my XPath locator and it's greater than a Twitter message to say like, goodness, this is hilariously large. Log that as a bug. You should not have to write those sorts of locators. If you find yourself writing those locators, you know, log a bug. Your automation is just as important to the organization as the production code, or it should be. It should be treated with the same level of respect. It needs to be checked into the version control system. It needs to be backed up at the same level of rigor that the production source code is, stored off-site. Just as much hours goes into the automation as in production code. So page objects, this is probably a bad example. Let's see if I got a better one. This is where I try not to show customer code, but at the same time it's the better code to show. All right, so this is the Sauce Labs website. So with locators, again, there's ID is preferred, but if you need to use a structural locator, try CSS. If not, use XPath. By using the page object pattern, one of the characteristics of it is locators are only referenced once in the entire system. So if a locator changes, you change it in one spot, and it magically propagates throughout the whole system. I can't find it now, but I had this amazing script that would grep through all of the scripts in a directory tree and change one string to another string. Because I had a locator, I would have to change all my scripts. And it was a pretty clever script, and I wish I could find it, but it is long since gone. So just having the locators referenced once per project is a huge time savings for maintenance right away. 1.0 application, it's really easy. You wait for the page to load. Unfortunately, fortunately for the user experience, well, usually fortunately for the user experience, and unfortunately for the automation experience, we are getting away from applications that you can just do, oh, the page is done loading, I'm ready to interact with it. Now it's done, it finishes loading per the browser, but then an onload event kicks off, which kicks off a whole bunch of JS, and you're not really ready to go until all the JS is fired. So you can do things like wait for a certain element to be present on the page because a bunch of JavaScript is injecting HTML into the page, or you can wait for it to be removed. And that works 90% of the time, especially if you're just waiting for the spinner. A lot of applications have like wait spinner that shows up in the browser, and when everything's done loading, then it gets removed. So you just wait for the spinner to be either not visible or removed. So you can check elements around that for synchronization. But the surefire way of fixing your synchronization problems is work with the developers. And you can do what's called a latch, which is basically it sets a flag in the DOM right on the window object when the AJAX events finish happening. So they do a bunch of clever JavaScript stuff, and when it's finished, then they write something out into your browser. And then you just pull that. So you aren't waiting for something that's on the page rendered to the user. You are waiting for something injected into the DOM by the developers to say, we are ready for you to proceed now. And again, this requires collaboration between the people writing the automation and the people producing the application. But that's so full of win, and that's how you have to do it for a lot of projects. I know for a fact that that's how Gmail automates their system. Because Gmail, there is no page load. You go to it and everything's just magically getting removed and buffered in memory and rendered only on display. So work with the developer team to get the hooks in that you need for automation. Log bugs. It's a good way to find out if your organization is really serious about automation, is log bugs around your automation. I need these hooks. I need IDs put in. And if they just get perpetually pushed down the queue and not prioritized, then your organization really isn't serious about doing automation. And so should you really be spending your time doing the automation? Or should you be doing manual testing? Because that's apparently what they prioritize. So let's see what other maintenance. It can fix synchronization problems, but at the same time, it allows you to write lazy, sloppy code because you don't have those tight synchronization points put into your script. So if you are experiencing lots of problems with synchronization, turn on implicit waits, but start to ratchet them back. Your goal should be to remove all the need for the implicit waits and have explicit waits put in. But it's certainly a way of allowing your automation to proceed and provide information to you while you try and debug these things. So just a little bit more on page objects. So the way I write page objects, again, it's just a pattern, so there's a whole bunch of information with different ways to do it. So this happens to be at a login page. So there's 4 elements I care about. Again, this is Python, so there's a username. These are all IDs. There's one ID of username, password, and a submit button with an ID of submit. And then there's a kind of nasty CSS selector that won't work in WebDriver. So if they changed username to login name or account name or some ID different than username, I change it in one spot, and my scripts now all continue to be able to log in. Then the way, because this is object-oriented, I've got objects that, in this case, they're text elements, and I override the getters and setters. So if I do page.username equals Adam, then it's going to inject the, rather than setting it on the object, it'll actually type ADAM in the username field in the browser, which is the way that I've written it. Likewise, if I say assert username equals Adam, it'll read the information from the browser. That's just how I have implemented the pattern. And then then here's my actual page object. It's all named login page, because I'm original like that. So then a page object has the elements, so the username, password, submit button, and then it has actions named like do something, or if it's a verb, then it becomes a method on the class. And more often than not, there's some sort of synchronization event at the end of it. And you probably can't see it at the back of the room, but there's a wait for page to load at the end of it, so that when the action returns to the caller, it's synchronized to the point where it's done. There's all sorts of information on page objects out on the net at this point. Last year's Selenium conference, that was kind of the theme. It wasn't intentionally the theme, but I think every single talk talked about page objects. and all those videos are online. So even if you're using a tool other than Selenium, if you're using Sahi or Water or whatnot, the pattern is applicable. So that kind of addressed the half of that, saving it to a file, is in the control of your language, with the language that you're writing the automation in. Capturing a piece of text from a website, if you're using Selenium, then you just get the element, get the text, and then you're back into your programming language, if it's Python or Java or .NET or whatever, and you save it to a file. Again, it's useful to think of automation tools like Water and Selenium not as tools, but as libraries. And then they just get included into your script. So it's one of the things like Selenium is not a testing tool. Selenium is a browser automation library. It's actually, the WebDriver API is actually going through the process with the W3C to become the standard for automating browsers. You can, there's two sides of the coin on this. You can either write your own framework, which is fun. I write frameworks. I distribute frameworks for people. So blatant self-promotion, if you need a Selenium framework in Python or PHP, I have one for you. It's open source. It's very useful to write your own framework. And so I call this the build your own lightsaber heuristic. So again, I'm a Star Wars fan. So in the official canon, not necessarily what has, there's now like the Xbox game, Kinect game for Star Wars, which is just a travesty. But in the official Star Wars canon, you couldn't go down to the corner store and buy a lightsaber. As a young Padawan, as part of their hero's journey to become a Jedi, they needed to go on the quest to find the jewels to construct their lightsaber. There's all sorts of storytelling archetypes in play here. And so that's what you're supposed to do. It's your tool, it's going to save your life, it allows you to do your job, so it needs to be attuned to you. The grip needs to fit your hand. The color, the type of gem meets your force requirements, blah, 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 blah. And when you're doing your automation, if you write your own framework, it is tailored to your very specific application. And that is an absolutely good thing. If you're using a one-size-fits-all framework, the problem you have is that it's trying to fit all sizes. And so there are compromises that have been made, or may have to be made. And I've had to do this before. We had a Java applet application that we were automating, and we were using Windrunner. And it couldn't find our objects. And so what we had to do was we had to pay Mercury a whack of money to provide us a custom library that we then had to modify our application to integrate with. So we had to change our application at a very low level to support the tool that we were paying lots of money for the right to use. But if we had written our own framework using our own custom GUI library that we had done, I'm not sure if we could have done it in this particular case, but it would have been a very specific targeted framework for our application, rather than a generic one that's supposed to apply to all domains. So I think it's useful if you are heading down the automation career path. I think it's useful that you write a couple frameworks. The ones that I distribute, this is about the 7th iteration of them. I've learned things as I go along, and it's just got to the point where I bundled them up for distribution because it was easier than having people fork my GitHub repo all the time. So patterns around creating automation frameworks. There's not really a set of patterns, but it's useful to understand the common pieces that I think make up a framework. You have the runner. So you have, if in Python you have PyTest or nose or PyUnit, Java you have JUnit or TestNG. These are all the runner. Their job is to collect the scripts, execute the scripts, and figure out and collate the results. That's all they do. You need some sort of driver application or driving library for your application. So if you're doing iOS, the driver might be native driver. If you're doing browser automation, it might be Selenium or Water. And you need to sort of keep these things separate and understand that if you're going down the framework route, I am deciding on this runner and this library. And then the framework comes into place. It's sort of the opinions that you lay over top of these things. I think that you should only use page objects. So I'm going to write my framework so that it's really, really, really uncomfortable not to use page objects. If you've ever looked into Ruby on Rails, is a good example of a framework. There's the underlying language, which is Ruby, and then and the interpreter is kind of the runner. But then DHH has a bunch of opinions saying, you should put your .rb files in this directory. You should put your image files in this directory, your JS files in this directory, your CSS files in this directory. And that's the opinions that are being laid over top of everything to construct the framework. So does that answer the framework questions, which I think was the front table? Maybe not. I don't know. Whoever had the black paper or the black marker. So the line between UI automation, service automation, API automation. Yes, there are lines of distinction, and it comes to if the way I sort of draw the lines of automating the browser, what you need to automate in the browser, and only what you need to automate in the browser. So working from the lowest level up, if you have like a service-oriented architecture, distributed services, you don't need a browser to test the services. All you need to do is a simple Python script to hammer against your services. And crazy enough, that's what I'm talking about tomorrow afternoon. You can do, if you test your services, the services layer extensively, then all you really need to do is test the wiring between the UI layer and your service layer. Because you've tested that if I send this information down, I get this string back. All you need to do then in the browser is, does the string that is returned back from the service actually get displayed in the browser? And you only need to do that once, because it's the same string that's being called back. So there is certain, there's speed benefits of that. There are other tools that are starting to emerge where you don't even need the browser to test the JS effects. Things like Jasmine, which I haven't played around with enough, but it allows you to do behavior-driven development with JavaScript. So you have a whole bunch of scripts that you can run, and it does all the JavaScript logic for you. So now you don't need to do that in the browser, because every time you open up a browser, it's slow. You can't help but have, you wait for the CPU cycle to spin up, create the profile, update the profile, load the page. Whereas if you just grab the JS file and call 1,000 method calls on it, then that's really fast. We got 2 minutes. Anybody have a
So if you're a test lead and you're responsible for automation, but you don't have a lot of knowledge, what are the 3 things I should pay attention to my automation to make sure that it's not going off of the weeds? What are the most important things to pay attention to?
Is it providing useful information? Is really the only thing that your automation should be doing. That's the whole purpose of your automation, is does it provide useful, actionable information? And a lot of times it doesn't. I tell people that you should probably throw out most of your automation. If you're writing good automation code, you are finding a whack of bugs as you are constructing it. Afterwards, it's not going to find that many bugs. It really shouldn't, especially if your developers are writing unit tests around, the bugs that you've discovered when creating your application, your UI automation. So I have recommended people, and I've done this myself, where I'll write this grand automation script and then throw it out because it's never going to find another bug. So, which kind of comes back to the how do we determine cost effectiveness of automation, otherwise known as the ROI question. The only way to determine our ROI of automation is to have a time machine, because you can do your automation, then you go into the future some point in time and figure out how much money you made or lost based upon doing your automation. And you do that for every bit of automation. It's the only way you can actually do it, because you are reacting based upon information that it found. It found a bug, and you did something. It didn't find a bug, and you did something. So not only do you need to acquire yourself somehow a time machine. But the problem happens is if you've got a time machine, your competitors also have time machines. So you need to go further in the future to see how they react to your reactions to their reactions to your reaction. And your brain starts to explode fairly quickly. So there are lots of people that will sell you automation ROI calculators. There are some online, which are really funny to look at. But they're entirely a myth. Only you can tell if your automation is being effective, and it's only effective if it's providing useful information to you. And with that, we're 30 seconds or 45 seconds over time, but I'll be around for the rest of the day, and I'm supposed to go. I'm staying at my cousin's house, and he's not going to be home from work until 7, so I'll be at like the little mixer. So this is what I do for a living. I talk automation. So if you have other questions about it, then feel free to come up and snag me and we can chat.